I'm the first one to say that you can learn from the past, but I'm not so sure about this one. Hello and welcome to another episode of You and Me and Multiple Sclerosis. My name is Pam. I've been living with multiple sclerosis for 39 years. I saw this article and didn't get a chance to read it. And then I lost the bookmark. And then my husband said, "Hey, did you hear about this new thing they discovered about MS?" And I thought, I better go look for this article. And I went out and I did a search, and I'll show you what I found. I'll give you some commentary as we go along. It's something that I don't know if it's really going to change our lives very much. But the scientists involved in it certainly seem excited about it. Well, I was a little surprised. I had forgotten where I saw the article. I forgot to bookmark the page. So I thought, well, I think I could probably search and find it. So I searched for ancient DNA plus multiple sclerosis, because that's what I remembered from the headline that I had read. And look at what I found. This is really pretty incredible. So there's Yahoo.net and Deseret and Reuters. But as we start scrolling down here, look at it's the same basic article covered by CNN.com, Nature.com, NBCnews.com, USnews.com, WashingtonPost.com, CBSnews.com, Reuters.com, MedicalExpress.com, ScienceDaily.com, and then Science News. And there's more results, but let's just end the drama and click on Science Daily. And under Science News, they've got an article, Ancient DNA Reveals Reason for High Multiple Sclerosis and Alzheimer's Rates in Europe. So I think this sort of accounts for why this article made the mainstream the way it did. Maybe not so much for MS, but anything to do with ancient DNA, I think, gets attention. But once we start talking about Alzheimer's, that actually also gets people's attention. And we're just curious to see what is the hypothesis and how are they going about demonstrating this. It came out on January 10th, which is hot off the press, out of the University of Cambridge, which I'm happy to see because that is a very reputable institution. Why don't we go ahead and just read the summary, and that'll give us some clues maybe into what's going on. Researchers have created the world's largest ancient human gene bank by analyzing the bones and teeth of almost 5,000 humans who lived across Western Europe and Asia up to 34,000 years ago. By sequencing ancient human DNA and comparing it to modern-day samples, the international team of experts mapped the historical spread of genes and diseases over time as populations migrated. They found the following: the startling origins of neurodegenerative diseases, including multiple sclerosis, why Northern Europeans today are taller than people from Southern Europe, and how major migration around 5,000 years ago introduced risk genes into the population in northwestern Europe, leaving a legacy of higher rates of MS today. Okay, well, all right, that's an awful lot to claim one study. I'm curious, and I'm sure you are too, so let's just look into this a little bit more. So for the full story, researchers have created the world's largest ancient human gene bank by analyzing the bones and teeth of almost 5,000 humans who lived across Western Europe and Asia up to 34,000 years ago, just as it said in the summary. So by sequencing ancient human DNA and comparing it to modern-day samples, the international team of experts mapped the historical spread of genes and diseases over time as populations migrated. Sounds like a fascinating study, really. And I like this word international team because what it says to me is that it isn't just coming out of one research team in one institution, but that collaboration across different institutions has taken place, which always in my mind helps to validate the results that they are claiming. And they go on to say that the astounding results have been revealed in 4 trailblazing research papers published today, 10th of January 2024, in the same issue of Nature. Okay, right there, stop. As we know, Nature is probably the keystone scientific journal. If you get your article published in Nature, that can really make your career if you haven't already made it. So Nature is very reputable. They have a very rigorous peer review process, so we can assume that if it's in Nature, it got looked at and questioned and passed muster. So that gives me a little more confidence. So it's in Nature, and it provides new biological understanding of debilitating disorders. So far, I'm still very interested. By the way, I'm noticing these adjectives as I go along here. The editor in me: astounding, extraordinary, trailblazing. Yeah, there's like, can we hype this anymore? Well, maybe. Let's wait and see. The extraordinary study involved a large international team led by Professor Eske Willerslev at the universities of Cambridge and Copenhagen, Professor Thomas Verga at the University of Copenhagen, and Professor Rasmus Nielsen at University of California, Berkeley, and involved contributions from 175 researchers from around the globe. I like to see a large team of researchers, so I'm happy about the large team, I'm happy about the international collaboration, and I'm happy about it being in Nature. But it's still, it just seems like it's way overhyped, and I always get a little nervous about that. So here's what they found. Here's another hyper word. The startling origins of neurodegenerative diseases, including multiple sclerosis. Why Northern Europeans today are taller than people from Southern Europe. How major migration around 5,000 years ago introduced risk genes into the population in Northwestern Europe, leaving a legacy of higher rates of MS today. Carrying the MS gene was an advantage at the time as it protected ancient farmers from catching infectious diseases from their sheep and cattle. Now, okay, I really want to know more about this. I mean, if MS was an advantage, why is it no longer an advantage today? Some of us still are exposed to the same kinds of infectious agents. I don't know. I mean, one of the things I guess I'd want to know right off the bat is, those of us with MS, are we more or less prone to infections of that nature? And I don't know the answer to that. Let's see if they talk about it at all. And then the next is that genes known to increase the risk of diseases such as Alzheimer's and type 2 diabetes were traced back to hunter-gatherers. And then future analyses hope to reveal more about the genetic markers of autism, ADHD, schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, and depression. And I think now you're beginning to see why this paper has been reported on by just about every news media out there, because it does seem to claim a lot and would have sweeping consequences for many of the diseases that we are dealing with today. And let's go on and see if there's any meat to the research itself. Northern Europe has the highest prevalence of multiple sclerosis in the world. Although I don't know if you've been looking at videos that I've made and that Dr. Brandon Bieber's made, that's not as true as it used to be. But be that as it may, let's continue. A new study has found the genes that significantly increase a person's risk of developing multiple sclerosis were introduced into northwestern Europe around 5,000 years ago by sheep and cattle herders migrating from the east. By analyzing the DNA of ancient human bones and teeth found at documented locations across Eurasia, researchers traced the geographical spread of MS from its origins on the Pontic Steppe, a region spanning parts of what are now Ukraine, southwest Russia, and the West Kazakhstan region. And they found that the genetic variants associated with a risk of developing MS traveled with the Yamnaya people, livestock herders who migrated over the Pontic Steppe into northwestern Europe. These genetic variants provided a survival advantage to the Yamnaya people, most likely by protecting them from catching infections from their sheep and cattle. So most likely means this is a hypothesis. I don't know if they're going to go on and tell us more about how they came to believe this, but that's their hypothesis. But they also increased the risk of developing MS. So it was kind of one of those unintended consequences, I guess. The good news is you won't get an infection. The bad news is you're going to get MS. Oh, okay. It must have been a distinct advantage for the Yamnaya people to carry the MS risk genes even after arriving in Europe, despite the fact that these genes undeniably increased their risk of developing MS, said Professor Eske Villerslev, jointly at the Universities of Cambridge and Copenhagen, and a fellow of St. John's College, an expert in analysis of ancient DNA, and director of the project. And back to his quote way up there in the beginning, it's not as if people got to make the choice, right? There was still some kind of a biological advantage to carry the MS risk gene, even though it increased the risk for developing MS. And I'm not quite sure if they're going to tease out what that would be, or if that's part of the future research they're looking at doing, or what have you. But interesting, at any rate. It would imply to me that MS should actually be more prevalent in the civilizations from which these Yamnaya people came, but I don't know that that's true. I've looked at the world map, and yes, there's quite a bit of MS in that part of the world, but it certainly seems even more prevalent in certain other places. I don't know. I'd have to really study this, but I guess I'm not really totally convinced about this one yet. Let's keep going. He added, these results change our views of the causes of multiple sclerosis and have implications for the way it is treated. Well, that I don't know. Do they really change our view of the causes of MS? There's been a lot of study already about genetic markers for MS. If we have identified a particular gene, that's just part of the track that scientists have been on anyway. And implications for the way it's treated, I'm not really sure yet, until maybe he explains it more. I'm not sure what implications those might be, but let's continue. The age of specimens ranges from the Mesolithic and Neolithic through the Bronze Age, Iron Age, and Viking period into the Middle Ages. The oldest genome in the dataset is from an individual who lived approximately 34,000 years ago. The findings provide an explanation for the north-south gradient in which there are around twice as many modern-day cases of MS in Northern Europe than in Southern Europe, which has long been a mystery to researchers. From a genetic perspective, the Yamnaya people are thought to be the ancestors of the present-day inhabitants of much of northwestern Europe. Their genetic influence on today's population of southern Europe is much weaker. Previous studies have identified 233 genetic variants that increase the risk of developing MS. These variants, also affected by environmental and lifestyle factors, increase disease risk by about 30%. The new research found that this modern-day genetic risk profile for MS is also present in bones and teeth that are thousands of years old. These results astounded us all. They provide a huge leap forward in our understanding of the evolution of MS and other autoimmune diseases. Showing how the lifestyles of our ancestors impacted modern diseases risk just highlights how much we are the recipients of ancient immune systems in a modern world, said Dr. William Barry, a postdoc in the University of Cambridge's Department of Zoology and co-author of the paper. Multiple sclerosis is a neurodegenerative disease in which the body's immune system mistakenly attacks the insulation surrounding the nerve fibers of the brain and spinal cord. This causes symptom flares known as relapses, as well as longer-term degeneration known as progression. Professor Lars Fugger, a co-author of the MS study, professor and consultant physician at John Radcliffe Hospital, University of Oxford, said, "This means we can now understand and seek to treat MS for what it actually is, the result of a genetic adaptation to certain environmental conditions that occurred back in our prehistory. I am not exactly sure what the doctor's going to write on his prescription pad based on that, but I'm interested to see what they say." Professor Astrid Iverson, another co-author based at the University of Oxford, said, "We now lead very different lives to those of our ancestors in terms of hygiene, diet, and medical treatment options, and this, combined with our evolutionary history, means we may be more susceptible to certain diseases than our ancestors were, including autoimmune diseases such as MS." And then they go on to talk about the foundation and the center and all that. So we're not going to continue on with that, but this pretty much concludes what they have to say about this latest development. Okay, well, I just don't know how to feel about this. I mean, it's very interesting for sure. And I'm curious to see what further developments they will have and maybe how they flesh out some of their conclusions that they seem to be coming to, or the suggestive findings that they've had. Some of it just kind of runs counter to my understanding of how things work. For one thing, we know that ancient populations did not have much access to marriage across genetically distinct groups, so there was an awful lot of what we would today probably consider intermarriage. And when you intermarry with your close relations, what you end up doing is compounding the damage that a genetic mutation will do. And yet we don't really see an explosive amount of multiple sclerosis in the region that they're saying these folks originated in. I am no scientist, and I could be wrong about that whole thing, but it just seems to me like a question I would want to have answered. And then the comment that they make about how this is going to have ramifications for how we treat multiple sclerosis in the future, I'm not quite sure how. If you know that there's a genetic cause of MS, what does that mean? Does that mean that any baby in the womb that tests positive for that gene, they're going to abort them? I mean, I don't like where that's going. I don't know that there's gene therapy that would fix our genes after we're born. I don't know if there's a time limit for getting that done. I don't think it's going to help someone like me very much. Again, these are all just questions that I have based on the research, and I don't know where things will head from here. But boy, oh boy, the news media sure got excited about it. Well, let me know in the comments if you had already seen this somewhere or heard about it. Let me know your thoughts. I'm curious if you have questions or if you feel differently about this than some of the things that I've said along the way. I admit my tone has been a little bit sarcastic at times through this whole thing, and I don't mean to downplay the importance of scientific research and the findings that might lead to something that's important for the future. But I just felt like this particular article, the way it was written, was kind of overhyped. And I am always a little bit concerned when I see that, even though, as I said, it's very much in its favor that the article was published in Nature, that the research team is so large and spans the globe, basically, so that it's more likely to have some scientific credibility. But we shall see, time will tell. And I am going to be alert from now on to see if there's any new developments on this subject, and I will certainly let you know. But in the meantime, the only ancient bones that I'm going to be worrying about are mine. I think we all need to be taking care of our own ancient bones. And I'll see you again in my next video.